The pen was already in his hand, not hovering, not hesitating, already moving. The ink was ready. The document was open on the table in front of him, and the number at the bottom of that page was $250 million. To understand what that figure actually means, consider this. That is the kind of capital that funds entire startup ecosystems in Silicon Valley. The kind that moves quietly through private equity back channels in Manhattan and leaves no paper trail worth following, no institution willing to admit they missed it. The kind of money that doesn't just change bank accounts. It reshapes power. It rewrites who controls what. It buries secrets that people spend entire lifetimes trying to surface. And the only person standing between that money and the largest betrayal of that man's life was not a lawyer, not a bodyguard, not any of the trained, armed, experienced professionals positioned at every corner of that room. It was a child no one thought to watch. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room held itself completely still, the way a room does when something enormous is about to happen, and every person in it can feel it, but no one will say so. Expensive suits, quiet bodyguards, a foreign businessman sitting across the table with the relaxed smile of someone who had already decided he had won. Documents spread out in front of him, aged paper, official seals, signatures that looked as real as anything you'd find in a government building. The kind of forgery that takes months to construct, the kind that fools everyone. Almost everyone. Because near the back of that room, beside a silver serving tray, stood a little girl, 10 years old, my daughter of the Maid. She glanced once at her mother, just once, and what she saw in that look was not permission. It was fear. But she stepped forward anyway. And in the space between one breath and the next, her small voice cut through that silence like a blade. This is fake. 3 words. Quiet, steady, certain. Every dangerous man in that room stopped completely. And what came next? Nobody in that room was prepared for. What did she see that none of them did? And why was she the only one willing to say it? Here is what we know so far. A 10-year-old girl, daughter of a black maid working in the shadows of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in East Asia, just stopped a $250 million deal cold. 3 words. In a room where grown men with guns didn't dare breathe too loud. But here is what we don't know yet. How did a child raised in poverty, invisible to everyone in that room, come to understand something that trained negotiators, seasoned advisors, and battle-hardened criminals completely missed? What was hiding inside that document that no seal, no signature, and no amount of careful forgery could truly conceal? And what happened to everyone in that room after the truth came out? Because in a world like this one, truth doesn't come free. It always costs someone something. By the end of this story, you will see exactly how one small detail, the kind most people walk right past, unraveled a conspiracy years in the making. You will also understand why the most dangerous thing in that room wasn't the bodyguards, wasn't the money, and wasn't the man holding the pen. It was knowledge, quiet, inherited, and completely underestimated. The same kind of knowledge that gets dismissed in boardrooms from Houston to Boston every single day, right up until the moment it saves everything. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know where our community is. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we drop next. To understand what happened in that room, you first need to understand the world it existed inside. Because this was not a boardroom in the traditional sense. There were no HR departments, no legal teams on speed dial, no regulatory bodies watching from a distance. This was a different kind of structure entirely. One built not on paperwork and policy, but on loyalty, silence, and the kind of fear that travels faster than any memo ever could. Korean organized crime has operated in the shadows of East Asia for decades. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The organizations that hold real power in that world are known not by what they say publicly, but by what happens quietly when someone crosses them. Port operations, private logistics. Real estate moved through layers of shell companies. Money that enters one door as something ordinary and exits another door as something completely untraceable. If that structure sounds familiar to anyone who has followed the money through certain corners of American private equity, or watched how wealth moves through offshore instruments in the Cayman Islands, it should. Power, at a certain level, operates the same way regardless of the continent. And one of the most important pillars holding that structure together is something most outsiders never think about. Loyalty in that world is tied not just to the organization. It is tied to geography, to where you are from, your city, your district, your dialect. The room where this deal was taking place sat on the 14th floor of a private building in a part of the city where the wrong kind of attention simply did not survive long. Dark wood walls, lighting that was low and deliberate, a single long table dominating the center, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the faces of every man seated around it, back at themselves. The air carried the faint smell of expensive cologne and cold coffee. No windows that opened. The only door was behind the bodyguards. At the head of that table sat a man known in certain circles simply as Mr. Cho. Not his full name. Names like his were never spoken in full in rooms like this. 53 years old, sharp-jawed, completely still in the way that only men who have survived genuine danger learn to be still. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The people around him had seen what happened when he was displeased, and that memory was enough to keep any room orderly. Tonight, something felt different. Even his closest men could feel it, and they had learned over many years to trust that feeling. Stay with us, because the next few minutes of this story are going to completely change the way you see what happened in that room. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. The people who leave before the twist are always the ones who regret it. Her mother's name was Nadine, and if you had passed her in that hallway, tray in hand, eyes forward, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that the best way to survive in a powerful man's space was to take up as little of it as possible, you would not have looked twice. That was by design. Nadine had spent 11 years working in private households and secured facilities across the city. And in all that time she had built one skill above every other: invisibility. Not the defeated kind, the deliberate kind. She knew exactly how to enter a room, complete her work, and leave without a single person being able to say with certainty that she had ever been there. It was a form of discipline that looked like submission from the outside, but was actually something far closer to armor. Anyone who has ever watched a black woman navigate a space that was not built for her, in any city, in any country, in any industry, already understands exactly what that armor costs to maintain every single day. She had brought her daughter that night because the regular sitter had canceled last minute, and there was simply no other option. Ava was 10, quiet and well-behaved enough to sit in the back corridor and read while her mother worked. That was the plan. Stay in the hallway, stay quiet, do not come inside under any circumstances. Ava had followed the first two instructions perfectly. Her full name was Ava Miriam Osei. Small for her age, close-cropped natural hair, the kind of focused, still eyes that made adults slightly uncomfortable when they realized a child was actually listening to them. She did not talk much in school. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned early, the way children raised in difficult circumstances often do, that listening first almost always gave you more than speaking first ever would. Her grandfather, a man named Kofi, had been the most important person in her life before he passed away 2 years earlier. A retired linguistics professor who had spent 30 years studying dialects, regional language patterns, and the way human beings unconsciously reveal their origins through the smallest shifts in speech. He had traveled across 12 countries, spoke 6 languages with fluency and 4 more with enough competence to hold a real conversation. But more than any of that, he had a philosophy he repeated to Ava so consistently it had become the background noise of her entire childhood. A dialect, he used to say, setting down whatever book he was reading and looking at her directly, is not just an accent. It is a memory. It carries the streets a person walked, the market they bought their food from, the arguments their grandparents had. You cannot fake a memory. You can only imitate one, and imitation always has a seam. Ava had spent years sitting beside him, listening to recordings, repeating phrases, learning not just the words of various Korean dialects, but the feeling behind them. The Busan dialect in particular, coastal, rougher at the edges than standard Seoul Korean, carrying the rhythm of a port city, had fascinated Kofi deeply. He had a colleague from Busan, a man he corresponded with for decades, and together they had produced a small self-published journal on the phonetic identity of Southern Korean regional speech. Ava had read that journal so many times the spine had cracked completely down the middle. She was not supposed to be in that room, but knowledge never really stays where you put it. Mr. Cho had not always been the kind of man who sat at the head of a table. There was a version of him, younger, leaner, angrier, who had grown up in the port district of Busan with nothing particularly promising ahead of him. His father worked the docks. His mother cleaned offices at night. He understood from a very young age that the conventional path, school, employment, patience, was a path designed for people who already had something to protect. He had nothing. So he chose a different road entirely. By 30, he had built enough of a reputation in Busan's underground economy that the larger organizations in Seoul came looking for him, not the other way around. By 40, he had consolidated enough influence across 3 provinces that his name, spoken quietly in the right context, was enough to end a disagreement before it started. He was not reckless. He was not theatrical. He was methodical in the way that self-made men in dangerous industries have to be, because the ones who weren't were simply no longer around. But even men like Mr. Cho had pressure points. This deal represented something beyond the money. He had been working toward what wealthy Americans would recognize immediately: the pivot. The moment when someone who built their fortune in the shadows decides it is time to move it into the light. Private infrastructure. Legitimate investment vehicles. Generational wealth his children could hold without looking over their shoulders. The $250 million on that table was not just a transaction. It was the foundation of a transition. The same kind made quietly by powerful figures from Wall Street to Wilshire Boulevard for generations. He had vetted the businessman across from him for 3 months. Background checks, intermediary references, multiple preliminary meetings. He had been thorough. He had been careful. He had done everything right. And that, in the end, was exactly what made what happened next so difficult to accept. He had trusted the process. He had simply trusted the wrong man inside it. We're about to reach the moment everything changed. If someone sent you this video, they wanted you to see this part. Subscribe before the next twist. You'll want to be here when it lands. The businessman's name, as he had introduced himself through 2 layers of intermediaries, was Mr. Taewon Park. He arrived that evening in a dark car, accompanied by a single assistant, dressed in a suit that communicated wealth without announcing it. Everything about his presentation had been calibrated. The watch, present but not ostentatious. The briefcase, leather, structured, the kind that suggests contents worth protecting. The handshake, firm, brief, respectful of the cultural weight of the moment. He had done his research. That much was clear to everyone in the room within the first 60 seconds. This was not a desperate criminal improvising. This was a studied professional. The kind of operator that American audiences have watched bring down Enron, hollow out Theranos, and sit across from Senate committees with prepared statements and unbothered expressions. The architecture of deception at this level is never sloppy. It is constructed carefully, presented confidently, and designed to exploit the one vulnerability that even the most careful people carry: the assumption that someone who looks this prepared must be legitimate. The documents he presented were exceptional. Layered corporate registrations across 3 jurisdictions. Land acquisition records with verifiable parcel numbers. Infrastructure partnership agreement stamped by what appeared to be legitimate government offices in 2 countries. His assistant laid each page out in sequence, calmly, without being asked, as if the whole process had been rehearsed many times, which of course it had been. The seals were aged correctly. The paper stock was accurate. Even the ink oxidation on the older documents looked exactly as it should. Mr. Cho had reviewed preliminary versions of these documents twice before this meeting. His own people had cross-checked 3 of the registration numbers and found them clean. There was no obvious reason for suspicion. And yet, in the way that men who have operated in dangerous spaces for long enough develop a sensitivity that exists somewhere below conscious thought. Something in Mr. Cho's posture had not fully relaxed since the man walked in. He let the meeting proceed. He asked the expected questions. He received the expected answers. And then, at a moment that appeared casual, he shifted. Mid-sentence, without announcement, he moved from standard Korean into the thick, specific rhythms of Busan Dialect. A question about one of the land parcels, the kind of detail that only someone genuinely familiar with the region would know how to answer. Mr. Park responded. The words were correct. The pronunciation was close. The general shape of the dialect was there. Anyone listening casually would have nodded and moved on. It was almost perfect. And almost, in that room, was everything. Most people in that room thought it was over. They thought the deal was done. But one person in the back of that room heard something no one else caught. And the next 60 seconds would change everything. Don't go anywhere. Ava had not meant to be listening. She had come through the side door 3 minutes earlier, carrying a second tray of water glasses her mother had asked her to bring in quietly and set on the side table without making eye contact with anyone. She had done exactly that. Eyes down. Movements small. The way her mother had taught her. She was supposed to turn around and go straight back to the corridor, but then Mr. Cho had switched dialects, and something in Ava's chest went very still. She knew that dialect. Not from television, not from a language app, not from a single trip to South Korea she had never taken. She knew it the way you know something that has been handed to you slowly, over years, by someone who loved you. She could hear her grandfather's voice underneath every syllable Mr. Cho produced. The rhythm was right. The weight of it was right. The way certain syllables compressed at the end was exactly what Kofi had described in his journal as the phonetic signature of the Port District. And then Mr. Park responded. Ava's eyes moved up from the floor for the first time. The words were right, but the feeling was wrong. It was subtle enough that she almost doubted herself. Almost. The compression at the end of 2 specific syllables was slightly too clean. The transition between 2 phrases carried a pause that no one raised inside that dialect would have placed there. It was the pause of someone recalling a learned rule rather than responding from instinct. Her grandfather had a name for it. He called it the seam, the place where imitation separated from memory. Her heart was loud in her own ears. She looked at her mother. Nadine was standing near the far wall, completely still, tray held flat against her side. And when Nadine's eyes found Ava's, just for a second, just one brief collision of gazes, what Ava saw was not encouragement. It was a quiet, desperate, unmistakable instruction. Do not. Please. Do not. The pen moved toward the paper. Mr. Cho's hand lowered. The room leaned forward almost imperceptibly, the way rooms do when something is about to become permanent. And Ava Miriam Osei took 1 step forward. Have you ever had to choose between staying safe and saying what you know is true? In a meeting? In a relationship? In a moment where the cost of speaking felt too high? Then you already know what that single step cost her. Only subscribers see how this ends. If you haven't clicked that button yet, what are you waiting for? Every head in the room turned slowly. Not the fast turn of surprise, the slow turn of disbelief, because the mind, when it encounters something it cannot immediately categorize, moves carefully. And nothing in that room had prepared any of those men for what they were now looking at. A child. small, steady, standing in the space between the side table and the center of the room like she had every right to be there. Mr. Cho did not move. His pen remained in his hand, hovering just above the signature line. His eyes settled on Ava with an expression that was not anger. Not yet. It was something more controlled than that. It was attention. The particular kind of attention that a man like him reserved for things that genuinely surprised him, which was almost nothing, which meant that this moment was already unlike any other he had experienced in a very long time. Ava did not look at Mr. Park. Not yet. She looked at Mr. Cho and she spoke. In Busan dialect. Flawless. The real kind, with the compressed endings, the rough coastal vowels, the particular rhythm that her grandfather had spent decades documenting and she had spent years absorbing without fully realizing she was doing it. She did not perform it. She simply used it, the way you use a language that lives inside you rather than one you carry around as a tool. She told Mr. Cho that the man across the table had answered correctly, but not truthfully. That there were 2 moments in his response where the syllable compression had smoothed out in a way that no one raised in the Port District would allow. That the pause between the 3rd and 4th phrase was the pause of translation, not of memory. That she had read her grandfather's journal on Southern Korean phonetic identity enough times to recognize the difference between someone who owned a dialect and someone who had studied it. Think about what she was doing in that moment. A 10-year-old girl in a room that should have swallowed her whole, delivering the kind of precise, evidence-based analysis that trained professionals in this country get paid considerable consulting fees to produce. And she was doing it from memory, from love, from inheritance. Then she looked at Mr. Park directly and said, still in dialect, "Ask him where his grandmother bought her vegetables." The room was completely silent. Mr. Cho looked at Mr. Park, and in the quietest voice he had used all evening, he asked exactly that question. In dialect, specific, local. The kind of question a tourist could never answer, and a database could never prepare. Mr. Park's composure held for approximately 4 seconds. Then something behind his eyes shifted. The smile did not disappear. It simply stopped meaning anything. His answer came out in standard Korean, clean, unaccented, completely wrong. The pen came down, but not on the document. The room had changed its temperature entirely. What had been a closing was now something else, completely. What happened in the following 20 minutes was not loud. That is the part that stays with you when you understand how these environments operate. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, methodical dismantling, the kind that is somehow more frightening than noise because it tells you the people doing it have done it before and feel no particular urgency about it. Mr. Cho's most trusted associate moved to the table and began going through the documents with a flashlight and a magnifying lens that appeared from his jacket pocket as if this possibility had always been prepared for. What he found, once he knew what he was looking for, came quickly. The government seals on 2 of the documents were printed at a resolution that was fractionally too high, a detail invisible to the naked eye but immediately apparent under magnification. The paper stock on the oldest document was correct in weight but wrong in texture. The parcel registration numbers that had checked out in the preliminary review were real numbers, but they belonged to entirely different properties in a different province, linked through a shell structure so layered it had taken someone considerable time and skill to construct. This was not an amateur operation, and here is the part that should make every person watching this feel something real. Because this exact architecture, the layered shell companies, the borrowed registration numbers, the forged government seals, the months of careful relationship building before the ask, is not unique to this room or this country. This is the same structure that sat behind Bernie Madoff's operation for over a decade. The same structure that let Elizabeth Holmes raise nearly $1 billion from some of the most sophisticated investors in Silicon Valley. The same structure that collapsed FTX and took billions of dollars of real people's money with it. The details change. The design never does. The man across from Mr. Cho had built something that was meant to be invisible, and it would have been for everyone in that room if a 10-year-old girl had not been paying attention. Mr. Park's assistant had already tried to stand once. A single look from one of the bodyguards resolved that immediately. Now both men sat completely still, and the confidence that had walked through that door earlier in the evening had left so completely it was difficult to imagine it had ever been present. Mr. Cho looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Ava. Then he looked back at the table. He did not need to say anything further. The men in that room already knew what came next, and Mr. Park, for the first time all evening, finally understood exactly where he was. We know what you're thinking right now. What happened to them? Stay with us. The next part of this story is the one most people never see coming, and if you're not subscribed, you might miss it when we drop the follow-up. Hit subscribe right now. The details of what happened to Mr. Park and his assistant after that night are not part of any public record. In the world Mr. Cho operated inside, consequences were handled privately, deliberately, and without the involvement of institutions that ask too many questions. What is known is that neither man left that building the way they had entered it. Mr. Park's elaborate network of shell companies was quietly dismantled over the following weeks, accounts frozen, intermediaries warned, the web of false registrations unraveled piece by people who knew exactly how to do it without making noise. The scam was over, the man behind it was finished, and not a single headline was written about any of it. What this story will tell you is what happened to a 10-year-old girl and her mother, because that is the part that actually matters. Before Nadine and Ava were permitted to leave that night, Mr. Cho asked to speak with Ava alone. Not in the main room, but in a smaller adjoining space, with Nadine standing in the open doorway where she could see her daughter at all times. He crouched down to Ava's eye level, which for a man of his particular reputation was not a small thing. And he asked her, in standard Korean this time, how she had known. Ava told him about her grandfather, about the journal, about the seam between imitation and memory. Mr. Cho listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he bowed his head, not deeply, not theatrically, but genuinely. A short, deliberate gesture of respect directed at a child holding a serving tray. "Your grandfather taught you well," he said. "He must have been a remarkable man." "He was," Ava said. Within 2 weeks, Nadine received a private message through an intermediary. Her family's housing situation, which had been precarious for some time, moving between short-term rentals in a city where stability felt like something other families had been quietly resolved. A 2-year lease on a clean, safe apartment, eyes paid in full, left anonymously. No press release, no charitable foundation taking credit, no post about giving back, just a door that was now closed against the kind of cold that Nadine had spent years trying to keep her daughter from feeling. In this country, we celebrate the loud gestures of generosity. The quiet ones, the ones that ask for nothing in return, are almost always the ones that actually change a life. Neither woman ever spoke publicly about that night. Some truths are not yours to broadcast. They are simply yours to carry, quietly and with dignity. Think about what this story is actually about. Not the money, not the criminal world, not the dialect or the documents or the room full of dangerous men. Strip all of that away and what you are left with is something much simpler and much harder to ignore. A little girl paid attention when no one expected her to. She absorbed something her grandfather gave her. Not wealth, not connections, not any of the things we are told matter most. Just knowledge. Patient, quiet, unglamorous knowledge. And that knowledge, in one unplanned moment, changed the direction of an evening that was about to go catastrophically wrong. How many times have we watched someone in this country, polished, credentialed, connected, sitting in exactly the right chair at exactly the right table, walk into a room and walk out with something that was never theirs? And how many times was the person who saw it coming the one nobody thought to listen to? The junior employee, the outsider, the person only in the room to serve the coffee. We have seen this play out from Wall Street to Washington. The most dangerous blind spot in any room full of powerful people is the assumption that power already knows everything worth knowing. What would you have done in Nadine's position? Watching your child step forward into something you couldn't fully control or protect her from? And what would you have done in Ava's position, knowing something true, knowing the cost of saying it, and stepping forward anyway? These are not abstract questions. These are the questions that define the moments that define us. Kofi never knew what his granddaughter would do with what he gave her. He just gave it. Consistently, lovingly, without knowing the outcome. That is what real investment in another person looks like. Not a transaction, not a guarantee. Just the decision to pass something true onto someone you love and trust them to know when to use it. Drop a comment right now. Tell us, would you have spoken up in that room? We read every single one. We started this story with a pen hovering over $250 million and a room full of people who thought they already knew how the night would end. The same way rooms full of smart, careful, well-resourced people thought they knew how things would end at Enron, at Theranos, at every beautifully constructed deception that collapsed the moment one person, usually the least expected person in the room, decided to say what they actually saw. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And this channel exists to show you those patterns, one story at a time. The next story is already being built. It involves a woman who walked into a boardroom as a translator and walked out having stopped a 9-figure laundering operation nobody else in that building even knew was happening. The kind of story that makes you question every assumption you have ever made about who the most powerful person in the room actually is. If you're not subscribed right now, you won't see it when it drops. This channel is for the people paying attention, the ones who notice the seam. If that is you, make sure you're here. The quietest voices carry the longest,